in the pursuit of truth and common sense in an unbelievable world. You're listening to the Right Mind Podcast with your host, Todd Schowalter.
Hello, everybody. I'm Todd Schowalter, and welcome to Right Mind. Today is one of my favorite guests once again, Rich Rubino, my political analyst, and we are getting close to the midterm elections, which means this is going to be a very special show. How you doing, Rich?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on again, Todd.
Well, it's great to have you on. I mean, I've been looking forward to it and anticipating all that you have to offer today. Things are really getting heated up. We're about 3 weeks away. And there's still some things that are out there that, really aren't a sure thing. What are your big surprises and what do you think are sure things right now?
Yeah, and that certainly is the case. This is really almost unprecedented in that we really don't know. Stereotypically, the party in power, as you keep hearing ad nauseum, will lose in the midterm elections. George W. Bush in 2002, the Republican Party was popular, and after 9/11 in Afghanistan, the Iraq War was popular. Republicans picked up 8 seats in the House. The first time that's happened since Franklin Roosevelt in 1934. 1998, Bill Clinton's, the Democrats picked up seats when there was really a backlash against impeachment. The first time that's happened in a second midterm election since James Monroe in 1820. So if Joe Biden is actually to pick up seats, he would really be doing something that is almost unprecedented. But that being said, the polls are showing that Democrats are as galvanized as Republicans. What does that mean? Well, normally there's a lot of buyer's remorse in a midterm election, and the party that does not hold the White House, their voters are a lot more likely to be mobilized to come out and vote than those of the party that holds the White House. But this time around, because of, at least in the Democrats' case, dissatisfaction with Donald Trump because of the Dobbs decision on abortion, a lot of Democrats are as galvanized as Republicans, which really puts this in kind of almost a no man's land. And the other thing that's absolutely fascinating while all this is going on, a state, in the terms of the gubernatorial races, a state like Oklahoma, which went over 30 points last time for Donald Trump, the Democrat in some polls was actually winning. And contrary-wise, in a state like Oregon, which has not voted for a Republican gubernatorial nominee since 1982 and has not voted for a Republican presidential nominee since Ronald Reagan in 1984, their Republican, if this time around, is actually in a dead heat with the Democrats. So the gubernatorial races are really kind of contrary, I think, to kind of the general population of the body politic anyway. So it's really kind of fascinating that you might have a scenario where a state where Joe Biden is relatively popular, at least based on polls in Oregon, the Democrats could actually lose the governorship. And in a state, part of that is because the incumbent Democrat is not running for re-election. It's the most unpopular governor in the country. And in Oklahoma, Governor Kevin Stimpson has become very controversial, the Republican governor. So you have a scenario where Joe Biden is extremely unpopular, where a Democrat may actually win the governorship of Oklahoma.
Okay, well, you got a lot. Okay, you've got a lot of historical facts and things like, things that have happened in the past. But I'm just going to cut right to the chase. Do you remember a time when historically, I mean, things are just they're terrible right now. I mean, the economy's we're in a recession, whether they want to say it or not. Biden comes out a couple of days ago and says, we have a hell of an economy, or in those exact words. When we don't. I mean, we're in a situation now, at least in my lifetime, that's pretty unprecedented, that I've never seen anything like this. And I just don't see how anybody with any common sense can want this to continue. Do you think that's going to have any factor, not just on the Republican side, but also on the Democrats? You think the Democrats have just said, hey, we made a mistake, we got to fix this thing?
No, I don't. I think that Joe Biden is still relatively popular with the Democratic base. Now, that being said, there are certainly many Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren supporters who are not necessarily full throttle for him, but they support him because he is a Democratic president, and a lot of his agenda, including the Inflation Reduction Act, including, for example, what he did after the pandemic, trying to lower prescription drug prices, that was very much the platform of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. So they are going to stay with him.
Well, but the Inflation Reduction Act had nothing to do with inflation aside from just having the name and the title. It didn't reduce inflation. It'd be like me saying I've come out with a cure for cancer, but it doesn't cure cancer. I mean, a lot of these hypocritical things that are coming out right now, just from a partisan standpoint. I mean, you can say, well, I'm just going to vote this because it's got a D and this has got an R. But I mean, come on, people, don't you think it's time for the American people to say, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. We got to put an end to just this horrible stuff that's going on.
I think from a calculated point of view, there was much in that plan, as well as Joe Biden's economic plan, that was essentially somewhat Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society without the Vietnam. Some of them have been Democratic priorities for years. So as a result, they're going to stick with Joe Biden, even though a lot of them were incredulous of Joe Biden in the primaries.
Do you think he's even running the show, though? I mean, seriously. I mean, I don't think he is. And again, this is very just, opinionated, but I don't think, and again, I'm not trying, the guy put himself in a public figure standpoint. So I'm sorry, he's open for criticism. If he were just a cadre old man, by himself, I'd leave him alone. But I don't think he's mentally capable of actually doing the things that are going on right now. Do you think he's the one that's actually calling the shots?
I have no idea. My guess is that he is obviously with a coterie of other people. And obviously, I mean, a lot of this in terms of legislative agenda is really the Democrats in the House of Representatives and the Senate as well. I mean, they're the ones that are the engineers that get this essentially through the United States Congress. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, the leadership team. It was a leadership team, for example, the United States Senate, that got Joe Manchin to agree to certain pieces of legislation. If you can get Joe Manchin to agree, for example, then essentially, if you can get him to some sort of an agreement, then Joe Biden will sign the legislation. Now, how much actual pull Joe Biden actually has, how much of his influence, we don't know. But obviously, like in any other administration, there is certainly a team of people, and really the architects are in many respects the people in the House of Representatives and in the United States Senate that try to essentially importune people to vote for their legislative agenda.
Okay, well, getting back to the election at hand. Okay, we've got some we've got some interesting races going on now. Do you think that it's going to be a red wave? As I said, we've got some really teetering types of situations. We've got Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. We got Herschel Walker down in Georgia. We've got some things that are really getting a lot of the spotlight. What do you think what do you think are the main races that we should be paying attention to?
Well, stereotypically, since World War II, the party in power, who holds the presidency anyways, in the first midterm election, loses an average of 26 seats. Mm-hmm. Bill Clinton lost 53 in 1994. Barack Obama lost 63 in 2010. But on the other side of that, Ronald Reagan only lost about 26 seats in 1982. So it's really kind of unpredictable. And they're also, when there's an October surprise, like the Dobbs decision in abortion, that could potentially have an effect. The way the Cuban Missile Crisis benefited John F. Kennedy in 1962, and as a result, the Democrats actually picked up a seat in the Senate and lost 4 in the House. So, one of the most important races, obviously, the flagship races are certainly Georgia. Raphael Warnock is running essentially for a full term in the state of Georgia. Remember last time around, he was filling the seat of Johnny Isakson. Now he's running essentially for a full term. Herschel Walker, of course, is the Republican nominee. And that is really kind of, as I say, the flagship race in this country. They did have a debate. The first debate, I don't know exactly who won. The New York Times, although, was kind of skeptical of Raphael Warnock, which I think was kind of interesting. There was one issue where at one point Herschel Walker asked Raphael Warnock or the reporter rather, about issues about some tenants that he had, about evicting the tenants, and Raphael Warnock was kind of sporadic about that answer. On the other side, Herschel Walker doubled down on his argument that he did not pay for an abortion. So I don't know what's going to happen there, but I think what's fascinating, there's also a libertarian in that race. And under Georgia law, if you don't win 50% of the race, there's going to be a runoff between the two major candidates. Mm-hmm. Meaning, so let's say the libertarian gets 3% of the vote. Let's say Raphael Warnock gets 48%, wins by 1 point. Theoretically, we could have the exact same scenario as we had in 2020, where everything is going to come down in terms of the control of the United States Senate to Georgia. So that's going to be absolutely fascinating because, as I say, It's not going to be necessarily, unless somebody wins outright, and this is a very close election, there are 3 people in that race, unless somebody wins outright, there is not going to be a decision the night of on the night of the election. Another fascinating one, Utah. Now you're saying Utah, well, that's a Republican state. So Mike Lee's up for re-election. But what's fascinating is what the Democrats did here. They did not nominate a candidate. They actually nominated a former Republican, Evan McMillan. He's actually, he was somebody who was a very anti-Trump Republican from Utah, and he's not even a registered Democrat. And they nominated him as they put him up as their nominee. Now, Utah is one of the most Republican states in the country.
Right.
McMillan is saying that if he gets elected, he will not caucus with either party. And you say, well, he's an independent. Why would he caucus? Well, independents, when they get elected, they caucus with a party for one reason, because that party will seat them in committees. Angus King and Bernie Sanders are technically not Democrats. They are independents, but the Democrats hold the majority. So as a result, they give both of those senators their committee assignments. So, and for one, Bernie Sanders, chairman, for example, of the very, very omnipotent budget committee. So it's fascinating what's going to happen here. If it gets to a point where it's essentially where Democratic and Republican control is up to essentially is down to 1 seat, and Evan McMillan somehow wins, and it's not impossible that he wins this election, I could see both parties essentially promising some. Well, what can they promise them? Can they promise them a chairmanship? Can they promise some sort of, shovel-ready projects to Utah? Can they promise largesse? I don't know. But he's going to be the most powerful person probably since Dean Barkley. I say Dean Barkley because if you remember in 2002, when Paul Wellstone died in a plane crash, Governor Jesse Ventura appointed Dean Barkley, and this is for a very short period of time, as the interim United States Senator before there was actually an election.
So this was in Minnesota, wasn't it?
This was in Minnesota, but it was very important because both Trent Lott and Tom Daschle, the respected leaders of both parties, tried to persuade him to join their caucus. And essentially he said he would not join either caucus. So that's really the precedent. That's why I think that the Georgia race and the Utah race could be very much the most interesting races right now in the country. But I mean, you have so many other Senate races. Certainly you hear so much about the race in Pennsylvania and in Colorado. It's interesting. So Michael Bennet, kind of a low-key senator, actually ran for president last time around and got nowhere, dropped out after New Hampshire, as a matter of fact. His opponent is somewhat of an anti-Trump Republican, who is Jim O'Dea, who's actually saying that he will not support him in 2024. So as a result, Donald Trump is going to essentially assailed him, excoriated him on YouTube. I mean, on his media social network. So the question comes up on Truth Social, that is, will Donald Trump going after a Republican nominee, will it help the Democrat in that it degalvanizes certain Republicans potentially voting for a third party or not coming out? Or does it actually help the Republican because it distances himself from Donald Trump to show that I'm his own man? It's absolutely fascinating, but he's doing something that a lot of other Republicans are not doing. He is disavowing Donald Trump in many respects. So I would watch that race in Colorado as well.
Okay, we've talked on earlier shows about earlier times when, the parties have actually come together where, even though they put their different, you mentioned Clinton and who was it, Tip O'Neill, I think we spoke about, that even though we were divided, they understood that they had a job at hand. Yeah. It seems right now, and it seems for quite a while, I should say, that we are so divided that people are basically, I think they're throwing common sense and logic out the window just to stay with their own side. What do you think our best case scenario is to actually get people to work together again, to actually solve some of these problems, I should say? I mean, we've got, the situation now with abortion coming up with the Democrats that, granted, that's a hot topic, but come on, it seems like a deflection from the economy. I mean, what is it going to take for everybody to come all together here?
Yeah, well, there are some legislators that will simply, you're not going to see AOC and Marjorie Taylor Greene team up and sponsor legislation. That's just my guess.
Right.
Some people are not. Yeah, maybe they can name a post office after somebody. I don't know.
Right.
And by the way,
something else that is tanking the post office. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Bo Udall used to say, this congressman from Arizona, that the best way to take care of inflation is to have the post office run it. But
oh, well, and that's the other thing. And I'm not trying to digress here, but now we come back to these mail-in votes. I can't think of a worst case scenario to have the post office. My son got married. They sent out wedding invitations. There are people, this was like weeks ago, the actual wedding, that they sent these invitations out months in advance that are still just getting the invitations. I mean, can you imagine like a mail-in vote situation? I mean, I can't think of a more inept group to be handling this right now.
But back to your other point in terms of can things actually get done? Interestingly, there are actually certain pieces of legislation that actually are getting through. You don't hear of them that much. For example, Seth Moulton of Massachusetts and Chris Stewart from Utah, very much, both of them military veterans, very much on opposite sides of the political spectrum, got together and got passed in the House and the Senate, and Joe Biden signed it legislation that established the National Mental Health Hotline, for example. That's something, it's not a sexy issue, but that's something that people from disparate sides can essentially work on. So sometimes what you have is you'll have center-left Democrats and center-left Republicans, and they work on pieces that are not of legislation that are not necessarily controversial. Also, sometimes, as people say how polarized it gets, if you get so far right and so far left, eventually you get to that point where Ralph Nader's bicycle rams right into Pat Buchanan's Mercedes, and right means left.
Right.
You get that sometimes. For
example, I think we're almost there.
Authorization of U.S. force continuing the authorization of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, rather the act that essentially allowed after September 11th, that allowed United States troops to go into Afghanistan, and Sench gave the president somewhat carte blanche there. There were Democrats and Republicans, the libertarian right and the progressive left, that worked together to try against the reauthorization of that, for example. So there are examples when the right and the left, the issue of, for example, drug legalization, sometimes the libertarians and the liberals will agree on legislation, for example, to allow military people to use marijuana for medical reasons. So there are certain pieces of legislation, but generally speaking, the body politic right now is at a time where almost every politician, last time around, of 435 congressional districts in 2020, only 16 of them voted for a different candidate for president and Congress. In other words, like in Northern Maine, for example, they voted for Jared Golden, a Democrat, and they voted for Donald Trump. So it's very rare. What does that mean? It means essentially that the most perilous thing for most politicians running for re-election is not the general election. They're going to win in the general election because the way everything's been gerrymandered, but in the primaries. So if you're afraid of losing to somebody on your right is a Republican, a left is a Democrat, it's best for your political interests. And of course, self-preservation is the number one, is probably the number one human instinct, to try to be as far left or as far right as possible, and not work with the other party in the primary, hoping then in the general election that your either liberal or conservative constituency will reward you with that. And that is, in many respects, where we are right now.
Okay. And then again, you brought up the libertarians that come into the situation. Okay. And the libertarians, I mean, come on. I mean, what libertarian have you ever known that really thought they were going to win? It just seems like it's always they're going to split the vote. I mean, do you see a libertarian in this particular midterm election that could potentially actually have a chance
at winning? No. Now in Georgia, though, they could make the Georgia Senate race actually go into overtime, because if no one wins 50%, is there a libertarian at the congressional level that has a legitimate chance of winning, though? No.
Well, that's my point. If I'm going to come into a race as a libertarian, knowing that I'm 99.9% going to lose, what is my main motivation? Do you think we have people coming into the race for that sole purpose, just to like split? I mean, to disrupt the election itself? Just to split the ticket?
No, I mean, I don't think that's their objective. In some states, they're on the ballot because, for example, in some states, if you can get 3% of the vote, then your party is considered, the Libertarian Party would be considered a major party, meaning that the next election they can have primaries and they can get federal funding like other parties. That's why sometimes you'll see a Libertarian even going into a race. The best thing for a Libertarian is to go into a race for an office that there is no Republican running against or no Democrat running against. In other words, you just have the incumbent. Then a Libertarian gets in, and everyone who doesn't like that other candidate, maybe 15-20% is going to vote for the Libertarian. Then they become a major party. The other reason Libertarians get into it is they try to They try to present their message because their message is divergent from both the Democrats and Republicans. And obviously, when you're in a debate, you see a Democrat and a Republican, millions of people are going to see that libertarian. And as a result, the libertarian message is going to get out ad nauseum to the body politic. That's essentially the reason. But you often hear about this wasted vote syndrome. And it's no panacea, but the way that I think you can cure that is if you had essentially what they have in places like Alaska and Maine, instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting, where essentially you go to the polls, you vote for your first choice. So let's say, go back to 2000. Let's say your first choice for president is Al Gore. You vote for Al Gore. Let's say your first choice rather is Ralph Nader. So you vote for Ralph Nader, then Al Gore is your second choice. If Ralph Nader doesn't get 15%, Al Gore then becomes your vote. That way you could theoretically vote your conscience and vote the realistic choice. And then you don't have to have this kind of scenario where the two parties are omnipotent and any sort of a voice from outside, from off the reservation, if you will, like the Libertarians, the Greens, is considered a wasted vote. That's the only way I can think of really curing that and allowing people to vote for
but that too. I mean, again, that's why it's basically why Sarah Palin lost in Alaska, because you have like all these, to me it's very confusing. Like you said, okay, this is who I want. If I don't get that, I'm going to get this. Why can't you just vote? Hey, this is who I want. That's it. I mean, I understand it. Don't you think that kind of, to me, that seems a little deceptive? Okay, that whole system of a way of voting, knowing that I'm voting for somebody, but if the numbers don't add up, then I might not get the person that I voted for. I mean, thoughts? What do you think? I mean, do you think that you think that's really the way to go?
I think a voter gets the vote in the best of both worlds, in the respect that they actually get to vote their conscience. People don't have to make a strategic choice and say, well, I really want the Libertarian nominee, but he's not going to win, so it would be a wasted vote. So I'm going to go with the Republican, even though it's not my favorite choice. You can vote for the Libertarian and you can vote for the Republican. The other benefit to it is that whoever wins whoever wins is going to win a majority of the vote. So you don't have a scenario where somebody can win 27% of the vote. And this happens in primaries too. Let's say in a primary, someone wins 27% of the vote, and then the next candidate wins 22. So the guy with 27% of the vote lands up winning with only 27% of the vote. So there is that scenario as well. It does allow essentially, I think, the best of both worlds for voters. But you're right, it is confusing.
It's very confusing. I still don't understand it.
But I think essentially, the way you advertise, you just say, okay, you get to go in, you get to vote. There are three people running. You would just list your choices. You say, candidate A is my first choice, candidate C is my second choice, candidate B is my third choice. And then if candidate A doesn't get 15%, then your vote goes to candidate B. So essentially, you're allowed to vote your conscience, and you can never say again that a third party vote is a wasted vote.
All right. Okay. Speaking of the voters themselves, so let's come back to that. I mean, what do you think of the vote? I mean, I think voters are smarter now. I mean, I think it's harder to pull things over. For example, and again, this is just opinionated, but like this whole thing with the strategic oil reserve, releasing this oil so that we have lower gas prices for a couple of days, it's going to deplete our supply. Yeah. Do you think people are buying that anymore? I mean, I think in the past, the voters may have been able to be tricked or something like that. But I think with everything that's been going on, and not just this administration, going even back with the Trump administration, I think over the course of the years, with everything that's happened, I think the voters are a little bit more savvy. But you still see the politicians doing these things that, unless you're really dense, you're going to know what it's all about. I mean, do you think the voters are smarter?
I don't know if they're actually smarter. I know they're turning out a lot more.
Right.
In 2020, you had that was the highest voter turnout in a presidential election since William McKinley beat William Jennings Bryan in 1900.
Right.
In 2018, that midterm election, that was the highest voter turnout since 1904. So 1902 rather, in a midterm election. So there's an increase in voter turnout. But that being said, the reason I don't think voters are as sophisticated is because if you look at the advertisements, you look at the negative ads specifically, and you look at how they take technical truths and then they mislead. In most advertisements, people are seeing that and they're saying, candidate A, they'll say wants to cut Social Security because he said something that is essentially, he said something but was probably taken out of context. Or you see these other things. You see, for example, you hear this all the time. And this shows, I think, that voters are, I mean, part of it is say they have lives too. But if you see somebody going up and saying that this candidate is just like, they'll say candidate A voted so this many times with the Speaker of the House, or the other voted with Nancy Pelosi, or this candidate is somehow tethered or allocated to Donald Trump. Well, yeah, that technically may be true, but you're not actually going into what these actual votes are and how many of them are uncontroversial. You're just hearing, you're saying, wow, that candidate must be motorized or robotic and only supports this president, only supports the president, doesn't think for themselves. Usually, if voters were really sophisticated, all ads would essentially be positive, and they would come on. They would have the candidate coming on to television or the radio. They'd be saying, "This is what I've done. This is what I've done," and it's all stuff you can look up. But it's not, this candidate voted for 600 tax increases because there was a little tax increase in a 300-page piece of legislation, or this candidate is, somehow is this candidate essentially, appeared with Donald Trump, and then that means he's essentially the same as Donald Trump. So I think that political adsmen know this, and they've obviously there's a whole business to it, and they know how to manipulate voters.
Well, and that's just it. And I think, like any form of advertising, consumers or voters are getting smarter now. And some of these things I see coming out, I'm like, come on. We know what you're doing at this point. See, it doesn't make any sense. And I agree with the political ads. That goes with debates and everything. I think there ought to be a yes-no debate where you're asked a question and you either get to say yes or no. No hemming and hawing about it, yes or no. And if you start to say anything else, we cut you off. But they don't. I think it'd be great. But anyway, I'm going to move on to my favorite part of it. Whenever you come on, and we're down to our last few minutes here. Let's pick the upsets, Rich. The things that you see happening that a lot of us don't even anticipate that could and possibly will happen. What do you see?
I think 2 Senate races I think are interesting. Washington State, Patty Murray has been in there since first election 1992. She called herself a mom in tennis shoes. Polls are showing that she is not as ahead as potentially she should be in a relatively blue state like Washington. So I would watch. I still think she's going to pull it out, but I would watch it. I think it could be a lot closer. The other one would be in Iowa, Chuck Grassley. Now, Chuck Grassley is literally 89 years old, and he's a Republican running for re-election. He's a farmer. He's been relatively popular in Iowa. He visits all 99 counties every single year. But this time around, he's not as far ahead as potentially he should be in the state of Iowa. And there is some talk he's got a military person is essentially his opponent, who can potentially take some veterans votes, for example. There's a possibility that Chuck Grassley actually loses re-election. Now, this would probably be the person who served the longest to lose re-election since Ted Stevens lost to Nick Bayich in 2006, for example. So that's a very interesting election. It reminds me a little bit when Strom Thurmond ran for re-election in 1996, and he only won the primary about 60% of the vote. So that would be some. And the other, I keep talking about these governor's races, but the state of Oregon, there's an independent who's a former Democratic state senator who is running for governor of Oregon, who is siphoning off votes from the Democratic nominee. There is also.
What do you mean? Siphon? Just as far as
she's a somewhat of a centrist Democrat. She's running, and because she's in the race, she's making it a lot more competitive for the Republican. Gotcha. So it's almost like the Republican has to take on it has the advantage of taking on 2 Democrats. The fact that the incumbent Governor Brown in Oregon is the Democrat, is the most unpopular governor in the entire country, means that there is a scenario where for the first time since 1982, the Republicans could actually pick up the governorship in Oregon. It's the longest streak in the entire country of one party holding that.
Wow.
Okay. The other scenario, again, I bring this to Oklahoma. The Republican governor, Kevin Stitt, his job approval under 50% in a very conservative state. The tribes, all 5 of the tribes, have come together and supported the Democratic nominee, who, by the way, was a Republican until a year ago. So there's a possibility that Oklahoma in the governorship could actually go Democrat this year. Now, and the other ones that I believe is the most interesting races, I'd watch for that Northern Maine district where Gerald Golden, the most conservative Democrat, arguably in the House of Representatives, is up for re-election in a relatively conservative Aroostook County congressional district. I would certainly watch that one. And then the governor's races, I would watch the Florida race between Charlie Crist and Ron DeSantis. The reason I say this, Joe Biden on November 1st is going to perambulate, is going to travel down to the state of Florida to campaign for Charlie Crist. Charlie Crist is really the only Democrat in the country who has embraced Joe Biden. And when they asked after he won the primary over Nikki Fried, would you want Joe Biden to come campaign? He says, absolutely. I think he's the best of the best. I'll be honored to have him here. So he's doing a different strategy than every other Democrat pretty much in the country. And he's doing this in a very, very purple state of Florida. So it's really a risk. And the other reason I think this is a fascinating race is because when Joe Biden goes down and campaigns there, the thought is if Ron DeSantis wins re-election, he's immediately going to start running for president.
Right.
So there are three scenarios for Joe Biden. First of all, they knock him off. There's a complete upset, and he doesn't have to worry about Ron DeSantis because Ron DeSantis loses re-election. The other one is you do everything you can to weaken Ron DeSantis so that his victory is only a couple of points, so he cannot go to Republican primary voters and say, well, I just won my re-election by 7-8 points when he only wins by a few points. And the other is potentially if you go down there and you try to weaken him with a message, then that message that he's using against Ron DeSantis could be the message that either him or whoever the Democratic presidential nominee in 2024 uses to essentially go after him in the presidential election in 2024. So it's very interesting. And Charlie Crist is really, his strategy is different than just about every other Democrat in the country in that he is openly embracing Joe Biden in a swing state.
Yeah, that is rare right now. Well, I tell you what, we're out of time. As always, I find it fascinating, all the knowledge and insight you bring to the show. I can't wait to get together with you after the midterm election and see how this all panned out. One final thought, though, we kind of hit it on it before. As far as the Senate and the Congress, what do you think? Do you think it's going to go all Republican, or do you think it's going to be split?
My guess, and this is just a supposition, it doesn't really mean anything. My guess is the Senate is probably going to stay exactly what it is today, and Joe Manchin will continue to be omnipotent for another 4 years, and this is going to be for another 2 years, and this is going to be remembered essentially as the era of Manchin. In the House, I think that they will not pick up the normal 26 seats. My guess is the Republicans pick up about 11 seats, and it's going to be extremely, extremely close. And then the question is, what does Nancy Pelosi do? Well, if the Democrats can maintain control of the House, she promised a few years ago when she was running for re-election, there were dissident Democrats that made a deal. There were about 15 of them. They said, we'll vote for you if after 2022 midterms, you step aside and do not run for re-election as Speaker. So that's the deal she made. She's running for re-election in her district in San Francisco. Now, the difference between her running for re-election in her district and Speaker, theoretically, she could run for re-election and not run for Speaker. That was not part of the deal. But if the Democrats keep control of the House of Representatives, I cannot imagine a scenario where Nancy Pelosi says, you know what, I'm going to be a backbencher congresswoman from San Francisco, and I'm not going to run for Speaker of the House.
Yeah, I don't see that in a million.
She runs for Speaker of the House. What happens, and who will challenge her and who will challenge her for the caucus who will challenge her in the caucus? And the reason I say this is because from California to Oregon to Hawaii to Alaska to probably American Samoa and Guam and Puerto Rico and everywhere else, every candidate is running against Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi's only up in one congressional district, but every single Republican wants to run against Nancy Pelosi because she's unpopular. So a lot of these Democrats who are up for re-election this time, if they win, they're going to say, we need another leader who's less volatile, less controversial than Nancy Pelosi, and it's going to be an absolutely fascinating interchange.
Okay, well, that's going to do it. That's a lot of stuff to take in at the end. I'm still thinking about where this is all going to go, and I can't wait to follow up with you in November to see exactly what happened. So, as always, I want to thank you for being on the show, Rich. I wish you well. I'm sure you have a lot of other shows to do after this one because things are getting heated and interesting, aren't they?
Yes, indeed. Yes,
all
indeed.
Right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me today, Rich. I really appreciate it. And thank you for joining me, whether you've been listening or watching. I'm Todd Schowalter. And remember, if you don't have a right mind, you don't have a mind at all. Till next time, bye-bye.
This has been the Right Mind Podcast with Todd Schowalter.